My father chose me for himself. Those were the words that Elisabeth Fritzl used to summarize the unbelievable and disgusting and traumatizing events that took over her life and lasted 24 years. That's what we're going to talk about in today's video. So like I said in the intro, today's video is going to be a long one, well, fairly long. It's about a popular story that has been circulating the news and multiple blog sites, and I know I've seen a few videos about it on YouTube, but I don't think it's gone viral per se the way other stories like Elisa Lam or the Delphi murders have gone. But this story is quite traumatic. It is disturbing. So if you are sensitive to these sort of things, you should probably click out of this video at this point. But if you're okay and if you have a good stomach, then stay tuned for the rest of the video. Elisabeth Fritzl was held captive for 24 years by her own father. She was forced to live in disgusting, inhumane, unbearable conditions for 24 years of her life in a makeshift cellar in the basement of her family home, and only her father knew she was there. And the reason he did this was basically for his own pleasure. He kept her in there, sometimes in the dark, sometimes he wouldn't feed her for days, sometimes he wouldn't come see her for days or weeks. And he did this because he had a weird obsession with his own daughter. He forced her to have a sexual relationship with him, which eventually led to Elisabeth having 7 of his children. So Elisabeth was born on April 6, 1966 in a small town of Austria called Amstetten. She was one of 7 children. She didn't have much of a childhood growing up because she was only 11 years old when her father first started abusing her. And this pattern actually continued for several years before it intensified into what would be the worst nightmare of her life. It's believed that her father actually started building this makeshift dungeon after the first time he had abused her, and actually spent several years digging and setting up the dungeon for where Elisabeth would actually call home for the next 24 years of her life. So in 1983, when Elisabeth was 17 years old, she actually ran away from home. She ran away. She went to one of the larger cities in Austria called Vienna to stay with a friend of hers. Now, unfortunately, fortunately, her parents did call 911. They did report her as a missing person, so the police were searching for her, especially considering the fact that she was still a minor. She was only 17. So police searched for her and they eventually tracked her down in Vienna, where she was hiding out with her friend. But, unfortunately, the police didn't know that they were actually returning her back home to her abuser. And this part of the story is important because it actually plays a role into how her father was able to fool everyone for so long. This actually ended up providing an alibi for him. So on August 28th, 1984, Elisabeth was 18 years old at this point, and this was the day that her father decided to take her captive and finally use the dungeon he had been building several years for into actual use. On that day in August, her father actually lured her down into the basement by telling her that he needed some help. And his excuse was that he needed some help putting up a really big door. And this was one of the doors that eventually police ended up recognizing that led into the dungeon. But it was a very, very heavy door. So I guess technically he wasn't lying that he needed help putting it up. But he used this excuse to have Elisabeth come downstairs and kind of fall into his trap. When she was downstairs with him, he was able to get her to hold the door and pretend he was screwing in the hinges. But when she was least expecting it, he suffocated her with a rag that was doused in chloroform until she passed out. And then when she woke up, she reports saying that she woke up in a really dark room, handcuffed and chained to a metal pole, and had no idea what was going on. So to give you an idea of the cellar, this is a description of the sort of maze that her father had built and how much thought he had actually put into building this dungeon. So I'm gonna put a few photos that I found online here. It was 15 by 15 feet, no windows, with an electric stove, a toilet, and a small shower. She also reported that it was often infested with rats and swimming in sewage. Over time, as she began giving birth to multiple children, he generously increased the size of the cellar by forcing the children and Elisabeth to dig narrow passageways that would eventually turn into the other smaller rooms. By the time she was rescued, there was the original cell space, 2 sleeping areas, a tiny living area which connected to a padded, soundproof room. This labyrinth was hidden behind 2 secret doors. The first was a 3-foot door hidden behind a bookshelf and paint cans, followed by a narrow corridor that led to the second door. This one was actually over 600 pounds of steel and was electronically locked, and only Josef knew the code. In total, the cellar was no more than 650 square feet, and the ceiling was only 5'6", and the only ventilation that was coming in was from a small tiny tube. So most of you are probably wondering how Elisabeth was able to go missing for 24 years without this ringing any serious alarm bells. Well, going back to the story of where she had ran away when she was 17 years old, this gave her a history of being a runaway. So her dad, knowing this, used this to his advantage. So on the first day that she did go missing, her mom was worried. Her mom was wondering where her daughter could have gone. But her dad kind of brainwashed the mom into really believing that she had chosen to run away and just didn't want to come back because she already had a history of running away. So when the police were called, the dad gave them this excuse, and because the police had no reason not to believe them, this kind of lost momentum, and eventually the police just kind of wrote it off as her running away, not to mention that she was also 18 years old now, which makes her an adult and gives her permission to make these decisions without letting anyone know. So to solidify the reasoning, or I guess the excuse you could say, that her father had fed to police and to his mom, he actually forced Elisabeth to write several notes, and this happened multiple times throughout the years that she was held captive. And in the first note, he actually forced her to write a note saying that she had ran away to a small town called Brunau in Austria. It was postmarked from that city, and in the note she claims to have run away to join some sort of cult, a religious cult, and that she gave her parents a warning not to come look for her because she didn't want to be found. And she also included in this note that if they were to come look for her, then she would leave the country. Now, the first few weeks Elisabeth was held captive were probably the worst that she had to go through the entire time. She was held alone, mostly in the dark really, for 4 years. And the only time she saw her father was when he came down to have his way with her or to feed her. And this is just how she lived her life for 4 years. It was really, really sad and disgusting to think how her own father could have kept her under these conditions for so long. So in 1988, Elisabeth actually ended up giving birth to her first child, Kirsten. And this quickly followed the birth of her other children. Her other children were born in 1990, and this child was called Stefan. Then came Lisa in 1992, Monica in 1994, twins Alexander and Michael in 1996. Unfortunately, Michael ended up dying 3 days after his birth, just due to negligence and really disgusting conditions where she had to give birth to these babies. And he was actually cremated in the basement fireplace that they had. And then came Felix in 2002. Now, just because she was having babies and she was becoming a mother and had other responsibilities, this didn't stop her father from doing disgusting things to her. Her father would actually come downstairs and force Elisabeth to watch adult movies with her and then force her to reenact them with her. And sometimes he would do it while the kids were sleeping literally 2 feet away, since it was such a small space. this was his way of maintaining control over her and, you know, actually just humiliating his daughter. So as time went on and as more children were being born, Joseph quickly realized that, you know, 600 square feet is not enough space to raise 6 children, have a wife, and for him to go downstairs. So he started concocting a plan that would allow him to somehow bring a few of these children upstairs. He first decided to bring up Lisa, followed by Monica and Alexander when they were born. And his excuse, or his way of getting away with this, was coming up with a story and forcing Elisabeth to write another letter that stated that she had been giving birth to children in this religious cult, but unfortunately this cult just had no room for children. They did not allow them. So in her note, she said that she would be dropping off the child at her parents' doorstep and would apologize to them, but she would be asking them to basically raise her children. So her father would actually put the baby outside the front doorstep with the note, and then, you know, coincidentally come across the baby and show his wife that, oh look, Elisabeth has run away, and this is further proof into the story that she did join a religious cult. She's now leaving babies at our doorstep. The reason he didn't bring up all of the children was because her first 2 children, Kirsten and Stefan, were now a little bit too old. They were getting to the point where they could talk, they could remember things, so this increased the chance of them kind of exposing their father. So he just thought that it was probably not a good idea to bring them upstairs, so he left them downstairs with Elisabeth. Now Felix, the youngest of the babies, he, at that point in 2002, didn't think that his wife would be able to care for these children anymore. Unfortunately, Felix was left downstairs to stay with his mother and his oldest 2 siblings. So during these years, Joseph and his wife were actually granted permission, or like legal standing of guardianship, over the 3 children that he brought upstairs that were actually Elisabeth's. And they actually did go through the formal and legal paperwork of adopting these children, which is actually really crazy because in the 60s, he had actually been charged for breaking and entering and raping a woman in the past, which was shocking because in 1967, he was charged with breaking and entering and actually raping a woman. So he had a history of being a sexual predator, but this completely went uncaught, because in Austria they have a law where after 15 years your criminal record gets wiped. So by the time he had adopted these children, there was actually no sign that he had any bad reputation, any criminal history, so he was able to get away with that. Now I'm sure many of you are wondering, how did his wife not notice what was going on? She was living in the house. She was literally 1 floor above Elisabeth for 24 years, and she had no idea any of this was going on. I know when I was reading into this case, I was really shocked as to how there was no noise, or how she just didn't think to go downstairs. Like, how could someone get away with hiding this from their wife for so long? Well, unfortunately, because it was in Austria and because of the generation that Joseph and his wife came from, his wife had a tendency of really just listening to him and being a submissive housewife type of stereotype, and she did listen to him. Like, he would tell her, don't come downstairs, I'm working all day, leave me alone. He actually did have a workshop downstairs where he would design blueprints that he would build out machines and sell them to certain firms and whatnot. So he did have a reason to go downstairs and spend all day there, but he actually ended up spending, sometimes he would spend 24 hours down there, and he would tell his wife, don't come downstairs under any circumstance, I don't want to see you, and she would just obey him. During this whole time, the Fritzls actually did have several apartment units, and they did have several tenants in the building, including one on the main floor of their actual house that they were living in. Now, several of these tenants did report weird noises. They didn't report them to police, but when they were interviewed over the investigation, they did say that they would often hear banging and odd sounds coming from the basement. But Joseph had actually told them upon signing their lease that the basement, the cellar, was completely off limit. They were just not allowed to go down there. He would often blame the weird sounds that were coming from the basement on faulty pipes or just the weather, the house settling. So there was really never any investigation into these odd sounds coming from the basement. So on April 19th, 2008, Elisabeth was now 42 years old. And this was the day where she would actually be released, well, at least temporarily. So on this day, her oldest daughter, Kirsten, had actually fallen really sick. And it's hard to believe that she wouldn't fall sick after living in those conditions literally her entire life. So seeing how ill her daughter was, she was able to convince her father to take Kirsten to the hospital. So seeing how sick she was getting, her father agreed. But before Josef would take her to the hospital, he actually forced Elisabeth to write another letter. And in this letter, he told her to write an explanation about what was wrong with Kirsten and why she couldn't be there. So with this letter in hand, he forced Elisabeth to help carry Kirsten up the stairs into the normal part of the living area of the house. And that was the first time that Elisabeth had actually seen daylight in over 24 years. But this didn't last very long, because once Kirsten was upstairs in the living area, her father actually told her, go back downstairs, lock the door, and don't come back upstairs. And because she had actually been basically brainwashed for almost 24 years, she didn't think about leaving. She didn't think about running away. She just listened to what her father told her to do, and she did it. So Josef calls 911, he calls an ambulance, and they take Kirsten to the hospital. When they get to the hospital, the medical professionals start asking questions about what's wrong with her, like more about her medical history, where the girl's mother is. But all Josef would tell them was the story about how the mother had actually ran away, and that this letter was the only thing that he had explaining that Kirsten was ill and that she was an anxious girl. She wasn't used to being around people very much. So obviously this makes him look super suspicious. The whole story was very suspicious to medical staff. They didn't really believe him, but nonetheless they actually issued a news broadcast calling for Kirsten's mother to come forward because they needed to know more about her daughter's medical history. At the same time that this was happening, they had actually contacted a cult specialist in the area that knew a lot about the different cults of Austria and the general area where they were. And as he did his research, he was actually able to discover that no such cult existed. And once he told the police and the medical professionals the story, this really focused in on Josef. Now everybody was really watching him. So because Josef had actually installed a TV in the cellar, Elisabeth was actually able to see this news broadcast. And after seeing it, and once Josef had returned home from the hospital, she begged him over and over again to please let her go see her daughter. So reluctantly, he agreed and he took her to the hospital. So when they got there, they didn't tell anyone that they were going. They just kind of quietly arrived at the hospital and went to go see Kirsten in her room. But this didn't go unnoticed. A lot of the medical staff quickly noticed that the girl's mother was there, so they called in the doctors and they also called the police at the same time. Once the police got to the hospital, they right away started questioning Elisabeth and Josef about where she had been and why she didn't come when Kirsten was ill. And their story just wasn't making any sense. So they obviously brought both of them into the police station to be questioned. It took her a long time to feel comfortable talking to the police because she had been held captive for so long. She wasn't comfortable talking to other people. The only person she had interacted with besides her children was her father. So obviously this made her very nervous. She was very anxious at the police station. And it wasn't until she asked the police, or basically she made them promise her that she would never have to see her father again. And if they were able to keep that promise, then she would tell them the whole story. So once the police promised that they weren't going to take her back to her father, she started telling them the entire story of what had happened over the past 24 years. And she was actually at the police station till way past midnight telling them this story. while they were holding her father there as well. So as soon as she finishes telling them the story, they arrest her father and charge him with suspicion of serious crimes against family members. Elisabeth, her mother, and all of her children were taken into police custody. They were kept safe. They were kept away from their father while their father was also arrested and taken to jail. A few days later, they were able to do a few DNA tests to actually confirm that Josef was the father of Elisabeth's 7 children. And then a year later, in March of 2009, Josef actually pled guilty to all of the crimes, and these included murder of his newborn son, Michael, by negligence, enslavement, incest, rape, coercion, false imprisonment, and he was actually sentenced to life.
Josef Fritzl doesn't want the world to see his face. What he did for 24 years in the cellar of the family home is all too well known. It was a bizarre spectacle as he was led into the dock. The people are asking if there's an explanation for why you did it, says the reporter. Fritzl remains silent.
In the case of Josef Fritzl, the prosecutor of Amstetten accuses him of committing the following crimes: murder, enslavement, false imprisonment, coercion, rape and incest.
Fritzl admits rape, imprisonment and incest, but denies the murder of one of those 7 children by his failure to care for it.
Now you're all probably wondering, how could a father do this to his own daughter? That's literally what I was thinking about when I was reading about this case for the first time, and again when I was doing research for this story. I just couldn't believe that a father would do that to his daughter, let alone the children that he has with her. It was just the craziest, unbelievable thing to me. I did a little bit of digging online just to find out what theories people had as to why he could have done something like this, and I just want to mention that this isn't an excuse for his behavior. This is just more of an insider perspective or an explanation as to what makes someone do something so horrific like this. I actually came across an article where Josef was talking about why he had done these horrible things to Elisabeth, and in the article he actually states, "I always knew during the whole 24 years that what I was doing was not right, that I must be crazy to do such a thing, yet it became a normal occurrence to lead a second life in the basement of my house. I knew that she did not want it, what I did to her. The urge to taste forbidden fruit was just too strong." He then went on to claim that he actually was not the beast or the monster that the media was making him out to be. So I know a lot of you are going to have a hard time thinking, well, how could he not be a beast? How can he not be a monster? Only a monster could do something like this to their own daughter. Well, in his head, he actually thought that it wasn't that bad because he tried to make the whole experience as normal as possible for Elisabeth and their children. And his way of justifying this was him bringing the kids toys every now and then. He would bring Elisabeth flowers, he would bring her clothes, he would take her shopping by bringing her a catalog and telling her to look through it and pick out which clothing articles she liked, and then he would come back in a couple days with all of the pieces that she did like. He would install the TV for them, he would bring down movies. Even for Christmas, he actually somehow smuggled a Christmas tree into the cellar, put it up, and tried to simulate a normal Christmas with his second family, brought the kids a whole bunch of gifts down. He really did try to lead a second life with Elisabeth in the basement, and this to him made it seem like it wasn't that bad of a deal. However, he ends up contradicting himself because during the trial he ends up stating, "I had to do something. I had to create a place where I could keep Elisabeth by force if necessary from the outside world." So this leads people to believe that he was planning on doing this for a very long time and that he actually did this intentionally for really evil reasons. Now, both of these other stories don't end up making sense because during the trial he was actually examined by psychiatrists where they were able to determine that he was suffering from severe combined personality disorder after he was able to tell them that he had been planning to lock up his daughter for a long time and that he was allegedly, quote, "born to rape," end quote. I'd be curious to know what you guys think leads someone to do something like this? Is it more of a nature versus nurture thing? I know there were some theories out there saying that, again, this is not an excuse for his behavior, but I know there were some other theories out there saying that he was born into a different time where, you know, Nazis were still present in Austria and Germany, and the behavior then was a lot different, so that could have probably brainwashed him into thinking what he was doing was not so bad. Or was it a nature thing where he was born with a severe mental disorder where he just couldn't function the same way a normal person could? So I'm sure a lot of you are wondering where Elisabeth is now and how she's doing. Her children, and her mom were all taken into safety by the police. They were all actually given new identities and were relocated to an unknown or undisclosed location in Austria just for their safety. But from what I've read online, currently they all seem to be doing quite fine. It has taken them several years of therapy to really get over what happened over 24 years. You know, a couple years is not going to bring them back to speed, back to normal after going through all that for so long. But from what we know so far, they seem to be doing as well as they could be considering the circumstances. As for the house, it was actually, there were a lot of things being decided about the house. You know, there was people that wanted to destroy the house. There was people that wanted to sell it. There were people that wanted to keep the house as a museum. There was a whole bunch of different things that wanted to be done with the house, but it was actually sold in 2016 to unknown buyers that turned it into an apartment building after renovating it completely. But the cellar, the basement area, was actually destroyed, and I believe they actually poured concrete all over the cellar so no one could ever go in there again. So that does it for today's video. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Do you guys like seeing more true crime videos? Do you guys like it more when we do more paranormal stuff? Let me know in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video.